There's something really beautiful about regional American dishes, the stuff that you can only get in one specific part of the country. One of my all-time favorite desserts is king cake, something that's very, very specific to Louisiana and New Orleans. And it's a shame that not enough people know about it. I find that most people outside of the southern US have just never had one of these, and that's gotta change. I've got a very cool trick to maximize the moisture in this king cake, so let me show you how I make it. King cake is more of an enriched bread dough than it actually is a cake. Although cake is right there in the name, think of this more as a cinnamon roll or even brioche rather than a layer cake. So we need to think about it as such. If we want an incredibly tender and moist king cake, we can't just make a normal yeasted enriched dough. We need extra starch to trap in more moisture. And that's where the star of this dish enters the chat: potatoes. These cakes are huge and need to last a few days at minimum, unless you're planning on eating it all at once. And potatoes help with moisture retention. King Arthur Flour has a great article about this whole process, and I'm gonna link to it down below. Take 1/2 pound of washed and peeled Yukon Gold potatoes and cut them down into pieces for boiling. In my experience, pieces around this size will work perfectly because they'll cook quickly without absorbing too much moisture. Add these to a pot of cool water and bring it up to a boil. Once that water's boiling, we can drop the heat and simmer these until nice and tender, roughly 15 to 20 minutes. These have to be cooked enough so there won't be any chunks of uncooked potato in the dough, or that would cause an uneven rise. Once these potato chunks are tender, strain out the water and get to mashing. My recommendation is to push these through a sieve with a spatula or use a potato ricer if you've got one. Again, any chunks here will stand out in the final dough. This sieve method is what I like to use to get really smooth and creamy mash for stuff like shepherd's pie or a side for a steak. This perfectly smooth potato mix is the key to our king cake success. To a small sauce pot, I'll add 3/4 of a cup or 180 milliliters of whole milk, along with 1/4 cup or 55 grams of white sugar. Begin heating this milk sugar mix over medium flame until it reaches around 110 Fahrenheit or a little warmer than body temperature. If it's too hot, take it off the heat and let it cool, because that's gonna keep our yeast from doing their job, which is creating a beautiful rise and nice flavor in the cake. To this warm milk, add 1 packet or 2 1/4 teaspoon of active dry yeast. Within a few minutes, you should see this start to bubble and the mix should smell like nice bread or beer. This is our sign that the yeast is alive and doing its job. Really, this is gonna do an amazing job of creating a light and fluffy crumb structure with a nice bit of bite. If after 5 minutes your yeast has done nothing, you've probably got dead yeast and you need to start the mix over. Once you see that your yeast is alive and kicking, we can grab a stand mixer and begin building our dough. To our mixing bowl, add 3.5 cups or 420 grams of all-purpose flour, along with a large pinch of kosher salt. Salt's one of those key ingredients to good baking that most people don't think about. Just give that a good mix so it's fully incorporated. For stage 2 of mixing, we'll add our wet ingredients. That's both the yeast mix and our mashed potatoes. I'm gonna let that run on low until most of the wet has incorporated into the dry. Here's the kicker. There's currently not enough liquid in this to create a cohesive dough, so add 2 room temperature large eggs, one at a time. Let the first one almost fully incorporate before adding the second one. Once the eggs are combined, we can begin adding 1 whole stick of unsalted butter in stages. Each piece of butter should be almost fully combined into the dough before the next one goes in. I like to take a stick of butter out of the fridge and cut it into 8 pieces before I actually start on my potatoes. If you don't do this, you could just hit them in Chef Mike for like 5 to 10 second bursts until they're nicely softened. Adding the butter in stages like this ensures that the gluten is still forming in the dough, even when the fat in the butter is counteracting it. See, butter and other fats are called shorteners because they work to shorten the chains of gluten formed by kneading. With an enriched dough like this, it's a balance to create a final texture that's both light, chewy, and fluffy. It's sort of a baking miracle that this works so well. If you're doing this correctly, it's gonna take a few minutes, probably like 5 to 10, to fully incorporate our butter. After all this mixing, we should have a well-formed, slightly sticky, stretchy dough that we can turn out onto a floured surface. After a few final minutes of hand kneading on a floured board, we should have a solid gluten network, and the dough should pick up any last-minute flour it needs to correctly hydrate. It sort of self-regulates how much flour it can take. After a couple back and forths, the dough should look like this. It springs back slightly when poked, which means it's ready for proofing. Place this in a floured bowl and cover with a piece of plastic wrap. 1 hour in a warm spot will allow the yeast to give this dough its initial breath of rise. It's sort of our relaxing way for the dough to create nice pockets of air. So let me tell you part of the reason why I love king cake so much. So I grew up from first grade through the end of high school in an area just west of Houston. I remember after the tragedy that was Hurricane Katrina, there were a ton of immigrants from New Orleans that came to the Houston area, which for me in my high school experience meant that there were a ton of crawfish boils and jambalaya parties around graduation season. This also meant king cakes were a huge deal, and just like everybody in Houston knew and loved and respected the culture around king cakes and around the season of Mardi Gras. From January to March, you could go into any HEB and get like a ton of different king cakes. You could get the cream cheese ones, you could get praline, you could get apple, which was never really my favorite, or you could get the cinnamon and sugar, which is kind of like the classic what I think of as a king cake, and that is always my favorite. I was always enamored by king cake because one of my favorite things in the world is a cinnamon roll, and the cinnamon king cake is essentially just a big, large, massive cinnamon roll. So what's not to love about it? I know in certain parts of Louisiana, they even make a donut king cake, which is basically just a massive fried king cake, and I've always wanted to try one of those. I know Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love, but it kind of feels like that's a better term for New Orleans. And I think Mardi Gras in this whole season is just so emblematic of the love of the city, and it's part of the reason why I love king cake so much. The hour proofing is up, and you can tell it worked because the dough has almost doubled in size and it's much more relaxed. This is a great sign for our fluffy end goals. To make our process of rolling and transferring much easier, we'll do our shaping on a piece of well-floured parchment paper. The nice thing about this dough is that it's so soft, rolling it out is a breeze. You could pretty much just use your hands for this. This is a pretty high hydration dough, so make sure there's enough flour on top and bottom so it doesn't stick. Begin the process of rolling this into a rectangle, roughly 12 inches by 22 inches or so. Once it's about that size, we've come to an interesting crossroads: to braid or not to braid. I am fully in the camp that a king cake should be braided, but some people don't feel that way. If you don't want to braid it, you could just leave it at rectangle and then fill it and roll it just like a cinnamon roll. For us braiders out there, we're going to cut this into 3 even pieces lengthwise. Now we can add our filling onto each piece. Oh right, the filling. Let's make it real quick. Cinnamon sugar is the classic, and as I mentioned, it's my favorite. It starts with 1 stick of melted butter. To that, add 1.5 cups of white sugar as well as 1.5 tablespoons of cinnamon. Mix that until combined, and that's the simple cinnamon and sugar that makes this so craveable. If you want to add a secret ingredient that's going to make people question what's in your king cake, you could add nutmeg or cardamom for a little pop, but I'm just going to leave it as is today. Split that filling evenly between the 3 pieces of dough and begin gently spreading it out so there's even coverage. You could use like an offset spatula for this. I find it's really easy to use your fingers to do this because the cinnamon and sugar mixture can kind of cool down, and once it's cool, it's a little harder to spread with a spatula. It's more important here that the mixture runs the full length of the dough rather than the full width of it. Nobody wants a piece of king cake without the filling. It's not a big deal, but if you tear the dough here, you're gonna end up with a bunch of cinnamon sugar blowouts, so just keep an eye on that. Once they're all coated, each piece can be rolled up and sealed on the end. This process is super simple, just be sure to pinch the end shut once you get there. For the fun part, the braiding. One of the reasons I really recommend using parchment is that I can turn the whole sheet 90 degrees, which will make braiding 100 times easier. If you start at the top here, these pieces of dough are so long that you run the risk of sort of tearing them. They're a little bit harder to work with, so start in the middle. Cross your 2 outer pieces of dough slightly to the left of the middle piece. That middle piece is now on your right outside of that initial cross, so pass it over the closest dough strand. With any braid, you're essentially taking the outermost piece of dough and crossing it over, going back and forth from the left side to the right side. Once you start doing it, the rhythm is very easy to get down. At the end, you can sort of seal that one side, and we still have the other half to do. Give your dough a full rotation so the braided end is sort of furthest away from you, and now we have to braid inversely, which sounds kind of tricky and feels sort of tricky once you start it, but it makes sense when you think about it. Essentially, instead of taking the outermost edges and going over one another, we've got to go under one another. So same whole process, just backwards. You're going to take those outer pieces and go under the middle pieces. This ensures that the braid is even throughout the entire length of the dough. Feel free to pause this section and play it back a couple times so you can see how I'm doing it. Once you've got the whole thing braided, you can pull the entire braided piece of dough around to form a tight circle on itself. You want to roll and sort of gently pull the final pieces over themselves so they seal together. Move the whole parchment braid onto a large sheet tray, and this is another reason why I think the parchment is an underrated piece of equipment here. It makes this so much easier. If you don't have the parchment, you're trying to move this whole massive braid onto a sheet tray without any support. It's really difficult. There you have it. Look at this beautiful braided dough just ready to be baked. Okay, well, not quite yet. For this whole thing to properly rise and have the lightness we're looking for, we need to proof this at least one time before it bakes. Another 45 minutes to an hour covered with plastic wrap in a warm spot should give us the texture we're looking for. Cut to 1 hour later, and our braid should look like this. Nice and puffy and full of life and air, and it should spring back gently when poked. Brush the exterior with a little bit of whole milk or cream if you've got it around to ensure some extra browning on the exterior. This king cake is ready to head into a 350 Fahrenheit degree oven for right around 30 to 35 minutes. During that bake, the yeast is going to give our braid a beautiful rise and spring in the oven. You can see this whole thing is pretty massive. You do need a large enough sheet tray to bake this on. The dough is going to begin to brown and take on some slight complex nutty flavors, and a little bit of our cinnamon sugar mix is going to pour out and caramelize on the bottom. After around 30 to 35 minutes, we should have a fully risen, beautifully golden brown king cake. Kind of like a souffle, this is gonna sort of sink and settle before we can slide it off onto a cooling rack to cool, so give it like a few minutes in the pan. While it's cooling, we can make the cream cheese icing that, in my opinion, makes this whole thing really special. Into a mixing bowl, add half a stick or 4 tablespoons of softened room temperature unsalted butter, along with 4 ounces or half a stick of softened room temperature cream cheese. Whisk these together until fully combined. If they're not soft, you're not going to be able to whisk them together. To this combination, add in vanilla extract and a squeeze of lemon juice. I find that without the lemon juice, this doesn't actually taste like cream cheese icing. It's missing a little bit of that acidic lift. To really sweeten this and make it icing, you're going to add at least 1.5 cups of powdered sugar, upwards to 2 cups, depending on how thick and sweet you like your icing. Once that starts to mix together, add in just enough milk to create an icing that barely falls from the whisk. If you lift your whisk and it's not moving, it needs a touch more milk. If it's dripping like crazy off the whisk, you've added too much liquid and can adjust with that little bit of extra sugar we've got lying around. After about 30 minutes of cooling, we can safely apply the icing without worrying about it melting. Spread on that gloriously sweet, slightly tangy icing. I find that this does make a little bit too much icing for my taste on this king cake, but different people like different levels of sweetness. The icing and the filling are pretty sweet, and so just be aware of that when you're covering it. From here, we need to decorate it with the classic king cake Mardi Gras decor: gold, green, and purple sprinkles. With that, our king cake is complete. Well, besides hiding the traditional plastic baby in it, but I don't have one of those lying around. Traditionally, whoever gets that in their piece is the person who's going to bring the king cake to the party next year. Now, there are tons of different iterations of the king cake that spread all throughout Europe as well as the United States. The king cake is sort of a representation of the celebration of the 3 wise men and Jesus' birth in the biblical story. The French are the originators of this sort of style of king cake going back to the 12th century. New Orleans has a ton of French influence, and so it just makes sense that this king cake is sort of derived from that. Around the late 1800s, we really see this kind of modern style of king cake take place. We start to see the gold, green, purple decorations, we start to see the baby in the cake, and that's where this sort of modern version really takes shape. Traditionally in Mardi Gras, the purple represents justice, the gold represents power, and the green represents faith. Plastic baby that's usually in a king cake is there to, as I mentioned, signify the birth of baby Jesus, and it's kind of a symbol of luck. If you get the baby in your slice of king cake, it's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. You sort of want that, even though it means you've got to buy the king cake and bring it next year. I truly love food that has sort of this type of mythology around it. It's larger than life, and it represents so much more than just a sweet cake, and I think is what makes cities like New Orleans so special. Even in all the fun of Mardi Gras in carnival season, there's still a slight reverence to the history that's going on there. That to me is super cool. To me, king cake is like perfect with coffee. Again, kind of that cinnamon roll type vibe. It should be light enough to cut with a fork, but sweet enough to kind of get your back teeth kind of buzzing a little bit. It's like perfect that way in my opinion. You get the sweet, crispy sugar that's on top. You go back and forth between coffee and king cake. It is so perfect and nostalgic. It took me a while to get this flavor down right. Nailing the cream cheese to sugar to dough texture, all of that is kind of a hard balance to get right. I do think the potatoes really make a difference in the moisture of this cake. As you can imagine, it tastes like a cinnamon roll on steroids. And I think more people should be making it this Mardi Gras season. I'm going in for another bite. Massive shout out to the amazing people supporting me directly on Patreon through patreon.com/CameronMardi. They are the ones that make videos like this happen, so I really appreciate it. Consider checking it out and consider becoming a patron. If you're looking for another Louisiana recipe, go ahead and check out my catfish po' boys. I think those really encapsulate these sort of savory flavors of New Orleans really well. Thank you so much for watching. Cheers.